The leader of Venezuela has been arrested by American forces. I think this is a great opportunity to discuss something that I've been thinking a lot about, talking a lot about. I think what's happening in Venezuela, also what's happening in Iran, is highlighting something that is sort of central to the conversation and the climate, political climate, if you would, here in America, which is the difference between assessing a situation through the lens of a value system versus viewing a situation through the lens of political affiliation. You could just say politics. So I really want in this episode to discuss values versus politics. And with specificity, we're going to talk about Venezuela. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Iran, what's unfolding there. And the way that we, as Americans, and maybe other people that are part of Western civilization, should and could look at a situation and assess whether we see it as a win or a loss for our countries, for our society. I first want to take a look at Maduro. Who is he? How did he come to power? How has he stayed in power? And what has that meant for Venezuela? And what that has meant for the United States. And then we can talk about what it's meant for the world. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, how should we view this? Do we consider this a win for America? So, Simone, do you want to give a little bit of a history on how he came to power and how he stayed in power?
Hugo Chavez, he was the previous leader, president. We know he was also a dictator. So after he died, 2013, Maduro runs. He then ran again in 2018. So 2018, he was reelected, which was very disputed. People said there was a lot of voter fraud. And then just recently, last year, he was declared the winner again, which was extremely highly contested. All of the opposition was basically barred from running. We know that his opposition, she would have been his opposition in the last election. She doesn't even live in the country anymore. She had to escape. She was barred. And then there was another woman that she was going to have replace her after she wasn't allowed to run, and she was also barred from running. And anyway, it's just one fraud, one corrupt thing after another. So he is still the leader. The Venezuelans, the majority of the Venezuelans do not accept him as their president. So maybe we should just say leader out of respect for the majority.
Yeah, and so we see something interesting taking place, and it's not unusual, I guess, in one sense, globally, which is that across the world, there are people that are protesting this arrest, even on our city streets here in the United States, and specifically in New York, where he's being held and will await trial. And then in Venezuela, we have massive, massive celebrations, people weeping with joy in the city streets. And it creates this unusual, paradoxical situation where it may cause people, most of whom don't know much about Venezuela or what's happening there, to scratch their head, say, what's going on? So let's look at the why of those things.
I think one reason is that 86% of Venezuelans currently are living in poverty. And so that might be one reason why they're celebrating.
Which, by the way, is a very typical outcome of socialism and communism, is this form of quote-unquote equality where everyone is equally as miserable. That is usually the outcome, and you have a ruling class that has all of the money and all of the power, and they dictate and create a situation where everyone else is more or less equal, and in their equality, absolutely miserable. And Venezuela is a perfect example of that. And then what you have is you have that ruling class that will do anything to keep power over the people. This is much the same in many other places. Iran is a great example of that. And then there are more polished versions. Qatar would be one of those places where 80%, in fact, it's 88% of the residents in Qatar are not citizens of Qatar. They're actually foreign workers who live in the worst humanitarian situations imaginable, slavery, essentially. But let's read some statistics about why, in addition to what you just said at its simplest level, 80% or over 80% of Venezuelans live underneath the poverty line. In addition to that, since Maduro has taken power, he has performed 10,185 executions. Let me read that again. 10,185 Venezuelans have been executed under Maduro's rule. They've made 17,400 political arrests.
Meaning anyone that opposes Maduro.
3,500 people have just disappeared. We don't know where they are. There are 2,000 political prisoners being held captive right now in prisons in Venezuela. This number is pretty staggering. There have been 332,617 violent deaths under this regime. I'm not even going to call him a leader. This is a dictatorial regime that has ruled with an iron fist over this people. And this has led to, much of the world does not understand this, one of the largest refugee crises of our time, with 8 million displaced peoples, refugees, actual refugees. Over a third of the population of Venezuela left the country for one reason or another.
No work?
Yes, because of no work and also because of political dissidence. If you listen to the voices that are starting to show up on social media of why people are celebrating, you see people in the street crying because their son or their brother or their father was killed because of his political views in this country. He was being held in prison or was arrested and held in prison and since then left the country.
I heard a sad story. There was a girl who, they lived in Florida. She said, my cleaning lady, she was Venezuelan, and she asked her what she did in Venezuela, and she said she was a doctor. She was a doctor, left Venezuela, and is cleaning houses to make a living.
When I lived in Israel, after the Iron Curtain fell, and there was a mass immigration of Russians to Israel to the tune of 1.5 million or so. I don't know what it's at now. I worked at the time I was a goldsmith working after the army. I was working in a large jewelry manufacturing plant. It was the largest gold chain manufacturer in the world. And I worked, I would say at least 80%, maybe more of the workers, the factory workers there were Russian. And you had people of every walk of life. We had professors, we had athletes, we had, you name it, that were working in a factory coming out of that and grateful for that work. Their quality of life was better in Israel as a factory worker than it was under the communism that they'd lived under. But based on those statistics, can you see why Venezuelans, over 80% of whom are living underneath the poverty line, would be cheering in the streets at this? Now, you're also going to start to see these videos circulating about oil. Okay, there's going to be a lot of talk about oil. Venezuela, in fact, has the largest reserve of crude oil in terms of numbers of barrels of any country on the planet. And there is obviously a power play for that oil because that oil represents so many things, money and power and energy and so many different things that every country needs in order to run. We're saying all this in very, very simple terms. We also know that China and Russia were in bed with Maduro, and we'll talk more about that, as well as his deep collaboration with Iran and Hezbollah. You're going to hear from a lot of sides of the aisle here in the United States. You're going to have the far right-wing nationalist, isolationist, extremists that are going to be criticizing this government because of this move, that this is just motivated by corruption and so on and so forth. They're going to have their conspiracy theories. And then you're going to have the far left also that are obviously going to criticize literally anything that this administration does. So right. It doesn't matter. So oil, let's talk a little bit about it, Simone, and then determine, was this good for Venezuelans, this move, through the lens of oil? And was it good for the West? Was it good for America?
I think it's hard to say because a lot would have to be done. It's not like the United States is just going to jump in there today and just start shipping oil to the United States. It's not going to happen. I mean, they have the largest reserve of oil on the planet, but it's hard to extract, and they don't have the infrastructure to extract it. So they are producing 1% of the world's oil daily because they just don't have the infrastructure.
Don't have the infrastructure.
Right. So you would have to invest a ton of money into doing that, and it would take a long time. So we don't know. I mean, how could we know what that looks like yet? We don't know what's going to happen with the government and all that. But what we do know is, so Venezuela is heavily sanctioned, just like Russia, just like China, just like Iran. So they're really not able to sell their oil to many places, but they can ship it on those ghost ships we've seen. They fly under the radar, and so
Black market.
Yeah. So black market oil sales.
For those of you that never heard of it, look it up. Look up ghost ships. Look up the
crazy.
Oil trade, black market oil trade, so on and so forth. Who's engaged in it? Who are the players on the field?
Right. The people of Venezuela are not seeing the benefits of this. So I feel like no matter what happens from this point forward, it's better than what they have right now.
So let me pause there, because I think, again, in focusing on what we do know, and again, just looking at some global trends, and this is where we're going to fall back on values versus politics. And this is, I believe, at the crux of the conversation here in the United States right now. And this is the big moral dilemma of our time. It's reminiscent of some of our discussions that we've had about Qatar even recently, how you've got this country with immense wealth. Now, they're much better positioned and play the game much better than Venezuela has, right? They play both sides very, very well. But what we know is all of the wealth of Qatar is limited to an autocratic political ruling class. It's a monarchy / autocracy. The wealth does not ever filter down to the 88% of the population that are residents and create the wealth, the working class who create the wealth. And this is much the same for Venezuela, except they don't play the game as well. And they have enough reserves that it doesn't have to be as it is, where over 80% of the population live below the poverty line.
Why is Saudi Arabia so wealthy as a country? The people, the country, why are they so wealthy? Because they put systems in place. Their oil stabilizes their currency. They protect their country with their oil. And Venezuela could do the same thing. They have more oil than Saudi Arabia, but they don't.
So let's look back at, again, coming back to what we do know. Okay, here's what we can't know. We can't know exactly what's going to happen with the oil. Let's just be honest. We can't know. But what we do know is that oil right now is being traded on the black market to our enemies. Let's just say it. To places like China, Russia, and with places like Iran and these different places that are anti-American. So, in its simplest form, and what you're going to hear Venezuelans saying, I can't even tell you how many videos I've seen that are taking that argument, saying this is just about oil, this is just about oil. And there are Venezuelans, many Venezuelans, that are saying,
we don't
even
care.
If that were true, thank God, we would rather have the oil go to America so
and
that
get
they
paid
can
for it.
And get paid for it, so that it can bring wealth to our country, and so that it can lead to, hopefully, freedom in our country, as opposed to these oppressive, totalitarian regimes. Okay, so we don't actually know exactly what's going to happen, but we can look at it and say, it's better for the planet, as far as, from my perspective at least, and from the Venezuelan perspective, for this to be under American control, even if it were about that, which it's usually never about just one thing, okay? All of these situations are so nuanced in today's world, and we need to acknowledge that. And I want to get back to just a bigger picture perspective, which is that, and I think it's something that's just a healthy perspective on life, because especially when you live in a Western democracy, like we have the absolute privilege of living in here in the United States. And I think that this is a time in history to fall back on our value systems, which Western civilization has been built, which I believe here in the United States is what we call Judeo-Christian values. We've had this conversation before, and you're going to have those people that push back and they say, well, democracy, really came out of Greek paganism and then, went through Rome and eventually made its way here. And there is some truth to that. But we have what is called Western democracy here in the United States. It's a version of democracy that is a hybrid that took the Greek political form and structure and incorporated the Roman legal structure and then used those structures to promote Judeo-Christian values. Does that mean that everything the founding fathers did was moral and just? No, but it is, I believe, the best system for delivering a society that functions with freedom. The structure of democracy and judicial system that Western civilization is built upon only functions if we lead with the values that Western democracy was built to promote. The further we get away from the value system, the more we move into a place where we're under actual threat of existence. Look at what happened with the Roman Empire. Look at what happened with Greece. Look at what's happening in places like Great Britain and all across Europe right now. It does end up moving away from democracy, but where it starts is moving away from the value system. It's almost like I think we need to understand that just progress and the progression of things. I was thinking about this recently because I've sort of rekindled this passion of mine to play chess. Not a great chess player. I'm not a horrible one either, but I love to play chess. And the planet is almost like a chessboard in the sense that humanity, you could say, is always moving forward. So in chess, you've got different sides that are, trying to win, and they never stop moving forward. You don't get the luxury, for those isolationists that might be listening to this, you don't get the luxury of saying, well, I just don't want to fight. I just don't want for there to ever be a war or this, because you're going to be visited with it one way or the other. And the minute you stop understanding that and promoting your value system, you stand to lose, because the other side that are in opposition to your way of living are moving forward. Whether you want them to or not, whether you want to engage with them or not, they are moving forward and they intend to win. There's a simplicity to all of this that China and Russia, although you may not be aware of it here in the West, are making a play for that oil and winning. And they have been. They've been gaining power and wealth through immense corruption to promote their agendas, and they've been doing it successfully here in our society. What they've acknowledged is, if you're to break it down again to the chessboard, they can't beat us in kinetic war right now. So what they've sought to do is undermine us and defeat us subversively from within. Maduro was, in deep collaboration with Iran, the regime, not the people of Iran, and even in deep collaboration with Hezbollah, a terror organization. Okay?
Wasn't there a whole island in Venezuela where Hezbollah trained military?
There's a whole island. I forget what it's called. Maybe you have it.
Margarita Island or something.
Which is what a shame. See,
they're
trying to take away from us our margaritas. Anyway, no, but there's an island, Margarita Island, that is committed to Hezbollah activities, training centers. And again, in trying to assess what's happening here, whether you are pro-Trump or anti-Trump, or I would encourage you to not lead with that, but rather look at greater American interests and also the interest of humanity, and assess whether or not this was good for society.
As you're talking about politics and the values, I see a lot of contradictions. You have a party who does not want United States to produce oil, to drill, to frack, to make more pipelines. They want to leave it alone. So in order to get oil, you have to buy your oil from overseas. why wouldn't this be a great opportunity to open up a new trade partner? So it's like, instead of choosing to look at all of the good things, like, wow, the people who have been oppressed and living under this dictator, who have no voices, who are, being sold and trafficked and being kicked out of their country and have no money, they have no electricity. Like every other communist country, you get an hour or two of electricity per day. You get water at this time. Your supermarkets are empty. You don't have any money. So it's like, why not look at the good? If you're so worried about the oppressed and the oppressor, here's your moment. You should be cheering with the people of Venezuela. Like, wow, this is a chance they might not be oppressed. There's such a contradiction here.
Look, and we become so cynical in this country, and I understand it. I get it, right? There's the corruption in government. It runs rampant, and the media has been corrupt, and linear media. I get it. I get the frustration. But at some level, can you just look and say, okay, were the people of Venezuela being oppressed? Yes or no?
Right.
I mean, I don't see how anyone can answer that question with no. Okay. Now, we don't know who's going to come in after Maduro.
Right.
Right. But we do know that this was a corrupt dictatorial leader committing acts of violence against his own people, so on and so forth.
That's why they've arrested him.
But let's agree that it wasn't only that. That was the legal reasoning for this arrest, okay? But we would be naive to think that that's all it's about. We would also be naive to think, I had a conversation with a good friend of mine yesterday who was saying, well, this wasn't, driven by humanitarian. Okay.
I don't think it was either.
You would be naive to think that this is, but that doesn't mean it doesn't lead to good ends on behalf of humanity. It's not a game of either or. And I want you to listen for those voices. I'll bring one up now, Tucker Carlson, who's come out with his BS narratives on this, trying to frame Maduro as, some conservative leader, okay, great. So are all of the radical Islamists, they're against many of the things that are framed as being conservative values. So anyway, we won't get into all that. But some months ago, he was looking at Iran and saying, well, I don't think they're the greatest threat. I don't know anyone personally who's been a victim of radical Islamist terrorism, which, of course, he may not know them personally, but there are thousands of documented cases right here in the United States. Tucker, can you just look at this and say, this is a win? We don't know what's going to come after it, but this is a person and a leader that was corrupt, completely corrupt. You could do everything you want to try to frame him any other way, which just makes you less and less credible. How you have any credibility today is beyond me. But can you just look at this and say that we don't know who's coming in after him? Maybe it'll get worse. I hope it doesn't. But I'm glad that this happened and that this person is no longer in power and that somebody is doing something. There was so much criticism. In fact, there was criticism of this administration. I'm not going to name names because that gets us censored. But there are politicians that criticized this administration for claiming that they were going to arrest Maduro and not following through on it in 2020. And here we have him, and now they're criticizing him for doing this arrest without the approval of Congress, and which is just the height of hypocrisy. Obama bombed the F out of so many countries with no congressional approval. And I don't even know how many thousands of bombs he dropped without congressional approval. Real acts of war. Okay. And for all those isolationists out there that don't want war, I'd like to hear your criticism of this particular op. We should first be giving an applause to our men in uniform. Amazing, right? And then the brilliance behind this operation didn't lead to a war at this point, and hopefully does not. And this just does seem to be the MO of this administration. Same thing happened in Iran, and look what's happening there. There's unrest in Iran, and it looks like there's a potential for the toppling of this regime, this dictatorial regime in Iran. And we're seeing some of the same, it's the same rhetoric. And what you're seeing is an inability from certain political groups, an inability to show any type of positivity or celebration on behalf of the human populations of these countries, that these regimes that have oppressed them for decades, that these regimes are being toppled. Can we not just look for a minute and be happy for the citizens and residents of these countries and hope for something better, better successors, destruction of these systems that have led to these atrocities, these countries that are committed to unrest, that are committed to subverting and destroying America. Why can't we just look and say, boy, I'm glad that regime may topple? You know, that regime in Iran that every day on their parliamentary floor chants death to Israel and death to America. Wouldn't it be a good thing if that regime was toppled in the hopes that maybe something better could happen and that once again freedom could be restored to the population of that country?
Can you imagine there being 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 less terrorist organizations on the planet if we were able to dismantle Iran's proxies, their terror
proxies? Is it good to disrupt?
I think that's a good thing.
This is a question, and I don't know that I have the answer to it. I have my perspective. Is it good to disrupt systems that deliver oppression to countries, that deliver unrest to the planet? I believe that it is.
I think if you ignore everything that's happening in the world and all of these big powers, they're not going to stop, like you said. They're going to keep going, and they're going to keep coming after our way of life. They're going to try to dominate the world, right? Isn't that what they all want?
Absolutely.
So
and they're not even,
if we don't fight back or we don't try to stop them, then they are going to win.
They say it openly. Say it openly that we are going to destroy it. We could circle this back to Israel if we want. If I had this conversation with somebody yesterday as well, where I was saying this really, even what you're seeing, this global uptick in anti-Semitism isn't actually about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is always a symptom of something much darker. What's really the cause behind all of it is a desire to overthrow and undermine Western civilization as we know it and the value system upon which it's built. And a lot of those countries and individuals and influencers, they see Israel as the weak link. And it is the unintelligent in society that really does it just through a pure hatred motive. They just hate a people group. Well, then you're an idiot. I don't know what to tell you. But there are intelligent forces behind all of that are pushing all those narratives. And it actually doesn't start with, it may manifest as anti-Semitism, but it starts with an acknowledgement that what Western civilization is built upon is Judeo-Christian values. That is the origin. The 10 Commandments that came from the Bible is the backbone of the moral system upon which Western civilization was built. There is a commitment to the same value system and the same freedoms on behalf of humanity in Israel that there is in the Western world, in the United States. And that's why Israel is an ally. And should an ally be based on values, or should it be based on just power and greed and all these different things and personal benefit? I think it should be based on values. There are people that would disagree with me, but that's sort of what's behind the crux, and that's how Israel gets drawn into every conflict that's on the planet because of what it represents, and because those that oppose our way of living, Western civilization, see Israel as not only the origin, but also the weak link. One other thing that's of note is that the UN has come out in condemnation of this arrest, which shouldn't be too surprising, even though they've been a part of criticizing Venezuela. But it should merit the question, what do they stand for? What does the UN stand for anymore? Is it really an organization that is committed to bettering the lives of humans and of countries, or has it become simply part of this battle for power and wielding their strength, which is being a court of public opinion? The UN, for the most part, is not a court of law, but it is a court of public opinion. Should we be surprised they've come out in condemning this arrest? And we could look at the players on the field. We could look at the big five and those that are in this cooperation, if you would, with Venezuela. And do they seek to benefit or seek to gain? So these countries that have been sanctioned, Russia, and China. If you go back to the chess analogy, does anyone disagree that Russia is trying to move its troops forward and win? Does anyone disagree that China is trying to move its troops forward and win? Does anyone think that those countries are not committed to seeing the United States no longer be the world's major superpower? How do they stand to gain or lose from what just happened? And they're losing their ability to gain power over currencies and energy and so on and so forth through the black market, through this arrest in Venezuela.
Right.
Now,
Venezuela was the closest of their allies to the United States. You have a direct shipping route. They're very close to us. So losing Venezuela is a huge blow to them.
Yeah, you're hearing a lot of talk about hemispheres, right? We haven't heard much about hemispheres, since high school. But now you're hearing talk of Western Hemisphere because there's an acknowledgement that the United States hasn't been under an existential threat from outside the country for a really, really, really long time, okay? And I think that's actually part of the problem. I think that's how we've gotten away from just practical thinking and being able to look at something. When you are faced with an existential threat, it becomes, how do I survive?
Right.
How do I win? It's just win or loss. If I lose, I don't survive. My family doesn't survive. My bloodline doesn't survive. And my community doesn't survive.
Your values are put in check daily if your life is under threat.
And we just haven't realized an existential threat in a long time. But I think that's actually changing. So just sort of winding this conversation down. Every day I wake up, I feel grateful that I live in this country. I believe that this is, with all of its problems and the centuries of trying to improve and do better that have gotten us to the point that we are right now, I believe that the United States is the best place in the world to live. That I've been everywhere, but I've been around a lot of the world. And I believe the reason for that is our values, the values upon which this country was founded, established, runs, and exists. And I think, again, I would like to ask you as a listener to consider that and consider if your perspective is really through the lens of a value. And in some cases, the simplest form. Is this good for me? Is this good for my society? Where would I prefer to live? There's always going to be the lesser of evils that you're stuck with voting for. There are always going to be the dark spots in history that hopefully we've moved through and continue to do so. And, history will record this era with its dark spots. But is your commitment to the value system upon which Western civilization and the United States, this Western democracy, greater than your political affiliation? And should it be? And then through the lens of that, how should you view the current events of our time? It's easy to be cynical and jaded. I really think that is sort of the biggest stumbling block to Gen Z, the Zoomers and the youngest generation, because it's so easy to always point out. I had a conversation with someone of that generation recently, and they were pointing out, all of the evils on both sides. And I just said, well, what constructive are you bringing to the conversation? It's really easy to point out all the wrongs, but what is the right thing to do? What are you bringing that's constructive? And are you being naive in thinking that you're going to somehow be able to create this utopia, where there are no wrongs in society and where everyone has equality? That's just ridiculous. There's no such thing. You're naive if you think that. I'm not talking about equal rights. We should all be fighting for equal rights, but there's no such thing as equality. It doesn't exist anywhere. It doesn't exist in nature. If you put two of anything together, a living thing together, they are not equal. If you think that that's a possibility, you're naive. Values or politics, which do you lead with? Thanks again for listening. If you like what you heard here today and think it's thought-provoking, share it with somebody else.